All right, if you would turn to 1 Samuel chapter 29. We're still in our series titled Israel Wants a King, and we're getting closer to the end of the life of King Saul. 2 more chapters after tonight, and that'll be the end of his life. And we'll talk more about that when we get to it. I don't want to talk too much on that tonight, but if you remember, David and the 600 men that were with him and all their families and all their possessions, their animals, their herds, all that, children, had fled to the land of the Philistines and were living there, and he had made friends with the king there and become a good servant of the king there. The king was glad to have him, even though this king obviously knew who David was. He admitted that and was afraid of him at first, but David has proved himself to be a loyal subject to whatever king he lives under. And that's how we should be today, when whether we move around or we stay in one place and a new ruler comes to power, we should be good, godly servants and subjects and citizens to those in power. The New Testament talks about that. Paul wrote about that in a couple of different places, that we're to be good citizens of wherever we live, and it's to strive to live in peace with those that may do wickedly. Certainly, we know that the Philistines were living wickedly. They worshipped false gods and were constantly fighting with Israel. We see some more of that tonight. So it's a short chapter, but I thought about going into part of chapter 30 tonight, but with the weather and everything, my allergies have been acting up. I don't know how long I'm going to be able to talk, to be honest. My voice has gotten scratchy a few times this week, and a few times it was all I could do to talk with somebody, and it comes right back, so I never know. So let's start 1 Samuel chapter 29, verse 1. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And if you remember, Jezreel was where one of David's wives was from. And Jezreel is a popular place in the Bible, in the Old Testament especially. So anyway, in verse 2, and the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed on in the reward with Achish. And what this means is the lords he's talking about, these are the, if you've ever studied or think back on how things are set up, or were set up at least in Europe in the old days, and in some countries it's still that way. England, Great Britain is that way. There may be a few other smaller countries around Europe that still have some royalty. The lords here were basically property owners. They were the ones who controlled a certain area of the country, and they had servants that worked for them, people who managed their crops for them and their herds and all that. And these men would have small armies to protect their property with. Their servants, they would teach them to fight, and they would be warriors when the time needed, when the time would come. And in this case, he says they passed by hundreds and by thousands. It's a lot of men, several thousand men, according to this. And how many lords were there in the Philistines? I have no idea. It doesn't tell us. but there were several. And we see David here. Remember, David told the king that he would go with him and fight with him. He would fight against Israel, his countrymen. But what does the king do? He holds David back. David has become a close friend to the king, and the king is it's almost as though he's made David and his men, his 600 men, his private elite fighting force, or they're the protectors of the king. And David told him that, and I believe it was in the last chapter, that he would protect the king and protect his life during battle if he would let him go with him. So he's following behind the king. And in this case, the king's not out in the lead. That would be kind of insane, but that did happen from time to time. But in this case, the Philistines' tradition, anyway, was the king would fall back, and he might lead the army up to a certain point, but he would fall back eventually with his elite force that would stay with him, and instead of being up in the front of the battle. So these lords of the Philistines, those would be the ones that would go ahead. But then notice what he says in verse 3. Then said the princes of the Philistines, what do these Hebrews here? Why are these Hebrews, these people from Israel, why are they here? Talking about David and his men. And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, is not this David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days or these years, and I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me unto this day. The king says, what's your problem? These princes or lords of the Philistines, they've got a problem with David and his men being there. They're Hebrew. They're from the land of the enemy. How can we trust them? And the king lets them know that, look, you all have known that David was here with me. He's been here these days or these years. He's been there a while. He's been living with this in the same land with the Philistines for some time. And even though he's a good servant of Saul, or he was when he lived in the land of Israel, he's no longer living in the land of Israel. He's there protecting where he lives, or willing to protect where he lives. In verse 4, and the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him. And the princes of the Philistines said unto him, make this fellow return, that he may go again to his place which thou hast appointed him, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us, for wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men? Now, so the princes of the Philistines are angry with the king. You can't let this guy go with us. Send him back to where he was living, where the place where you appointed him. Remember, the king had given David and his men and their families a part of the country, an area, a city that they could have while they were living there. Ziklag was the name of it. It was where they lived. And so these princes tell the king, send him back there. Let him go back to the women and children. And the reason they give is because they're concerned that when the battle gets heated, how are we going to know whose side he's on? They're Hebrews. Now, that should tell us that there was something different about the Hebrews, right? People try to say today that the Philistines and the Hebrews, the nation of Israel, that you wouldn't have been able to tell much difference in them. But obviously there was a difference. They could tell a difference. But the problem was they didn't know whose side he was on. They were afraid that if they got in a heated battle, and what if the Philistines were winning the battle? What if David decided to turn his men around on them because his king, Saul, was being beat? That was their fear. They were afraid he would turn against them. Is not this David, of whom they sang one to another in dances, saying, Saul slew his thousands and David his 10,000s? That little song is popular, wasn't it? It was, everybody knew it. Even the Philistines, they knew it. Where did that song come from? Well, remember all the way back to the story of David and Goliath. After David killed Goliath and Saul put him over the army and he went and fought, the women danced in the streets and sang this song. Saul slew his thousands and David his 10,000s. What happened? That's when the problem between Saul and David started. Then Achish called David and said unto him, Surely as the Lord liveth, thou hast been upright, and thou going out and thou coming in with me in a host of good in my sight, for I have not found evil in thee since the day of thy coming unto me, unto this day. Nevertheless, the Lord's favor thee not. I've got to listen to them, is what he tells him. He said, they're my people. I've got to listen to them. I've not found anything wrong. The king smooths it over pretty good. He tells him there's nothing wrong between us. You've been faithful. You've been good. I'm not concerned about that, but the vast majority of his army had a problem with David being there. Wherefore now return and go in peace, that thou displease not the lords of the Philistines. Another possibility here is that the king was afraid that his own people would turn on David too and kill his friend. So he sends him back, sends David back home to Ziklag. And David said unto Achish, But what have I done? And what hast thou found in thy servant so long as I have been with thee unto this day, and that I may not go fight against the enemies of my lord the king? Notice how loyal David is. Again, I mentioned earlier, it didn't matter where he lived, he was going to be faithful to the king. As long as the king was faithful to him. That's how it worked. And this king had been good to David. He had given him and his men a place to live. He let him ride with them almost into battle, but they stopped now. And now the king is requesting he go back home. And David is confused. What did we do wrong? We're here to fight your enemies, the enemies of our king. And Achish answered and said to David, I know that thou art good in my sight, as an angel of God. Notwithstanding, the princes of the Philistines have said, He shall not go up with us to the battle. Wherefore now rise up early in the morning with thy master's servants that are come with thee, and as soon as ye be up early in the morning and have light, depart. In other words, go back home. You're free to go. The princes are upset. They don't want you here. You need to go back home. And it turns out later, we'll see later next time, that was best for David to go back home because things weren't good at home. So we'll look at that in the next chapter. Now for our last verse here in verse 11. So David and his men rose up early to depart in the morning to return into the land of the Philistines, and the Philistines went up to Jezreel. Now you notice the Philistines are already across the border into Israel. They're not in the land of the land of the Philistines anymore. They've gone into Israel, and so they're ready for battle, and they're going up to Jezreel. Now next time David and his men go back to Ziklag, and they find out that the Amalekites have attacked and have captured all their women and children and all their possessions and burned the city. It's an interesting story. And again, we read all this, things we read in 1st and 2nd Samuel. It's always amazed me how, and I know I've mentioned this before, but it's always amazed me how people who make movies or TV shows can't just follow the script that's given us in the Bible. I mean, is this not exciting stuff to read? Surely it is. I mean, maybe it's not as graphic as what we're used to seeing in movies, but it's graphic enough. And there's cases where it's more graphic if you want to get down to it. You get to where they talk about some of the battle scenes, it gets pretty graphic. And I mean, you go back to David and Goliath when he cut off Goliath's head. How much more gruesome can you get than that? You know, and David held his head up and then he carried his head back and showed it to Saul. You know, so why can't we just have things that movies and whatever videos that teach the truth? I understand you might have to add a little bit to it because there are gaps, but you know, there's dialogue maybe you might have to add or some things like that, but don't change the story. And that's the problem with a lot of those things that are out there today and have been for some time. They take these stories and they change them completely, and they don't even have the same meaning anymore. So anyway, enough of that. That's all we're going to have for tonight. Next time we'll start up with verse 30 or chapter 30, and we should finish chapter 30 next time, and then chapter 31 is the last chapter in the book. We'll get to that the week after. It's not a very long chapter either, but there's a lot